Here we go. Now it's time, it's 15:15. I welcome you all to this week's IRES research seminar, and it's part of our special analysis of the elections in the post-Soviet space in 2020. And as we all know, a large amount of attention has gone to the situation in Belarus after their elections in 2020. A chunk of attention has gone to Russia and their regional elections this year. And then another chunk of attention has gone to Georgia and its parliamentary elections. Perhaps a little bit lack of attention has gone to what's been going on in Ukraine, in contrast to some years ago when all the focus and all the attention was on Ukrainian politics across the whole world. So today we hope to remedy to an extent some of this lack of attention and bring us up to date with what's going on in Ukrainian politics, the recent elections that occurred on the 27th of October. And we have today a roundtable of 4 specialists who bring different things to our event and different perspective, which I hope will generate some new insights and a good discussion afterwards. Now, just to confirm the format of the event, each of the speakers will give their talks between 10 and 15 minutes. And then when all 4 have finished, we'll open up for Q&A. In the meantime, feel free to send questions into the chat, and I will collect them and provide them to our speakers when we finish. I will now introduce our speakers one by one. First of all, the first speaker is Yuri Matsievsky, who's a professor of political science and head at the Center of Political Research at the National University of Ostrog Academy. He is going to give us something of a general introduction to what is going on with Zelensky after 1.5 years of being president of Ukraine and what these regional elections suggest. After this, we'll move to Valentina Romanova, who is currently working in Japan. She is with the Japan Association for Russian East European Studies, but previously is well known in Kiev and Washington. And she will be looking at perhaps how we should understand the importance of the decentralization and the overall importance of regional elections for Ukraine's political trajectory. Third speaker is Elena Podolyan. She is based at Södertörn, and she's a research assistant at CBIS. And she's going to consider some of the dynamics in West Ukraine and how they compare to other parts of Ukraine in terms of the changing political attitudes there. And finally, Volodymyr Dubovik who is from the Odessa National University and Department of International Relations, is going to consider the Southeast Ukraine dynamic and perhaps touch on some of the questions of Russian involvement and pro-Russian parties in Ukrainian politics today. So I've introduced all of our speakers, and then so I will now pass the floor to Yuri, and I will hopefully ask you to unmute and we can begin today's event. Thank you, Yuri.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you for introduction. As Matthew has just announced, I will provide some general overview of Ukrainian political system. I will, whenever we looking at Ukraine and trying to understand the dynamics within Ukraine, we have also in the context of the last elections, we have to look at the 2 dimensions. And the first one is the relationship between the center and the local communities. And this issue would be more taken by the Valentina, but I will focus on the core of political system, political regime. And I have prepared some slides, and I will just display them on the screen. Just to check if you see the full screen.
Not yet. You still need to make it full screen. It's showing us the layout.
Okay.
Wakaz slide off, and then maybe can get you to the.
Okay.
And from the beginning.
Is it better now?
I think you have to press Snachala from the beginning. Maybe this will give us the full screen, I hope.
Okay. All right. All right. So, yeah. So when we look at the Ukrainian political system, we will see that the form of government is a semi-presidential system, currently with parliament having more power than the president. And this situation has changed over time. When we look at the type of regime, Ukraine has been hybrid regime mostly for the whole period of its independence, beginning since mid-90s. And what is important is that Ukraine's hybridity is not just a transitory phenomenon, but a stable institutional construct. And this stable construct survived both Orange and Maidan revolutions, and it has all chances to outlive Zelensky. And this is just one fact, one observation from this, that we had 6 changes of the form of government, but we had only 1 change of regime, which took place from the late 80s to mid-90s. Since then, Ukraine's political regime remained hybrid. This is not a conventional wisdom, I would say. This is my perspective, because in most literature, in most Western literature, you will find several episodes of regime change in Ukraine. But this is a little different from what is in a common sense. So when we look at the dynamics of political regime, we have to keep in mind 2 dimensions: actors and institutions. Here is my formula of a regime change, which is we need new players that would enter political stage. This is so-called elite renewal, and these new players should accept the new rules of the game. Whenever we talk about hybrid regime, we have to keep in mind that it's not just a mixture of some democratic autocratic traits. Beneath the surface is the interplay of formal and informal institutions. And in the case of Ukraine, the latter playing more important role. Well, I have accentuated three attributes of hybridity here. This is competitive elections, weak rule of law, and prevalence of informal rules over formal procedures. And when my major thesis of these talks is that we, in terms of regime, we will have continued hybridization. This is a process of erosion of formal procedures and constitutionalism by the range of subversive informal institutions like political expediency, clientelism, corruption, secretive deals among the elites, etc. And here just one example, latest example that we had provoked a constitutional crisis in Ukraine. On October 27, the Constitutional Court ruled that Ukraine's electronic declaration system is unconstitutional, and that system obliged officials to openly disclose their assets. By the same decree, the National Agency for Preventing Corruption, one of our latest anti-corruption bodies, was deprived of most of its powers, and the judges also canceled penalties for officials who lie in their asset declaration. That was highly political move by the Constitutional Court. And in response to this political move, President Zelensky convened a meeting of the Security and Defense Council, which ordered the government to reopen the declarations registry despite the court decision, and they were open. And later on, President Zelensky has also ordered the drafting of a law that would restore the constitutionalism in Ukraine. And most of all, this law requests that the Constitutional Court is to be dissolved. And this is another very hesitated move that provoked the intensity within Ukraine's political system. And I can see 2 reasons behind the Zelensky move: to restore his own popularity and his party popularity, given that his party performed very poorly on the local elections. And as most of Ukrainian President Zelensky is also interested in having a handy constitutional court. So here are some graphics that represent the falling popularity of Zelensky. A year ago, he had some 64% of support, and in June this year he has 38% of support. And the number of those who do not support Zelensky has grown to 45%. And this distance between these 2 figures it expresses a negative balance of trust and distrust. That already is happening in terms of Zelensky approval. And here is Zelensky electoral support rating. We can see this high peak, which is 73% at the times of elections, and now in September 2020, he has less than 30%, 29% it was his electoral support. He's still far behind his opponents. Most of them will have some from 5 to 15% of support, but still, if we compare to this high peak, so this is a dramatic decrease. And why is that happening? So I would say this is a normal dynamics of Ukrainian politics. The period from affections to antipathy is just about a year, and we are seeing this very perfectly in the case of Zelensky. And we have to keep in mind several factors. I will mention here just 3. This is personal trait of Zelensky. This is also societal frustration. This is the huge amount of promises were given at the beginning, and this is unfulfilled expectations. So the war is still going on. It is not that intense as previously, but still the conflict is not resolved. There is no social justice. There is no control of corruptions. So this pressure are targeting Zelensky very, very seriously. And there is also challenges posed by the COVID pandemic. And the government is mostly providing reactionary moves. They do not demonstrate any path toward controlling the crisis. They just simulating what was done in our neighbors, mostly countries which is on the west from Ukraine. So this pressure is serious, and the last constitutional crisis put additional strain to the system. So Zelensky in very uncomfortable situation at the moment. So when we look from the helicopter view on what is going in Ukraine, so I returning to the 2 dimensions: the governance, which was initiated, the governance reforms and the decentralization reform that was initiated in the aftermath of Maidan revolution. It was started in 2015. And this reform is going on, and the last local elections were taken by the new electoral code. So I guess my colleagues will explain more about the specifics and the outcomes of these elections. And with regard to regime, it is, as I said at the very beginning, it is continued hybridization. That is weakening of the rule of law and overall constitutionalism by corrosive practices. And my thesis here also is that Ukraine will neither democratize nor digress to authoritarianism. There is no prerequisite, social prerequisites in Ukraine to become more authoritarian, but we still have a systemic and structural constraints toward Ukraine's moving into democratic directions. So Ukraine will be a hybrid regime for minimal to longer term distance. It's hard to predict which path will take Ukraine later. And the result of these local elections and the crisis is not overall good for Zelensky, and Ukraine become more fragile to internal and external threats. Thank you. This is all that I would like to tell today.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Yuri. And that's really set the stage very nicely for the rest of our event. So now I will move on to our next speaker, Valentina Romanova. If you're able to unmute, I will pass the floor to you.
Thank you very much, Matthew, for your warm welcome. I'm switching for my slideshow right now. So hopefully things will work out quickly and successfully. Can you see my slides?
Perfect.
Great. So I should be able to move them. So basically, I will start from the fact that by now, by the 3rd of November, the Central Electoral Commission of Ukraine has not yet presented the official electoral outcomes for all sub-state elections, and therefore it is possible to analyze only those electoral outcomes that are based on exit polls, on the one hand, and those parts of data that the Central Electoral Commission shares with us. These mainly refer to local elections, not regional elections yet. So what we see is clear. We see the lowest turnout since independence, which is truly regrettable. It is less than 37% across the country. We also witness the fact that the party in office gained far less votes in comparison with its own electoral performance at the recent parliamentary elections. And also we observe that oppositional new and regional parties managed to gain leading positions. This outfit refers to the second order elections, when they are held 1 year after general elections, according to the second order elections theory. That theory was developed back in 1980 by Reifenschmidt, and it makes us wonder, how comes that Ukraine's recent regional elections fit the second order elections so well? Let me highlight the fact that second order elections are those ones where there is less at stake in comparison with general elections. And here we are talking about the responsibilities, the functions of authorities that are elected. So basically we observe a paradox. How comes that Ukraine's recent sub-state elections are second order ones if we know that there is actually so much at stake in comparison, at least with all previous sub-state polls? So first of all, as Professor Yuri Matsievsky has highlighted, actually the recent presidential and parliamentary elections have changed the political landscape in Kyiv, but has not referred to sub-state scales. Basically, last year there were some considerations to call for early regional elections in order to reload regional, first of all, regional councils, but also sub-regional local councils. But because such potential calls lacked any legal grounds, such suggestions were never taken seriously by policymakers. Also, about a year ago, there were serious attempts to shift the city Kyiv's mayor Klitschko in order to at least make it possible for the centrally appointed executive to share responsibilities. But actually that political decision was not taken seriously as well. And only a week ago, sub-state elections were held across the country. So basically my point is that first of all, there was a lot at stake, at least for political parties. And first of all, for the party in office, there was a lot at stake at the recent sub-state elections in Ukraine. The second point basically refers to the decentralization reform that is in place for about 6 years by now. Indeed, by the time the recent local elections were announced, the amount, the number of local councils to be elected reduced tremendously. About 11, even more than 11,000 communities managed to merge together into about 1,400 amalgamated territorial communities. So voters could cast their vote for less councillors in local councils. But we are talking not about the numbers. The responsibilities of local councils increased dramatically. So they were already taken responsibility for public service delivery, first of all for schooling and for providing administrative services, but also for healthcare, that is tremendously important in Ukraine. And apart from being institutionally able to do the job, they actually managed to do so because of fiscal decentralization. Ukraine arranged direct interbudgetary relations between the central budget on the one hand and local budgets on the other hand. And also Kyiv granted more opportunities for local budgets to collect local taxes. So basically, by the time the recent sub-state elections were announced, it was clear that local councils gained more powers and monies, while regional and sub-regional councils by that time shared their responsibilities with their lower scale counterparts. But apart from that, the number of sub-regions was reduced dramatically from around 500 to around 136 to be precise. The major point was to improve the government functions and to ensure that there was proper coordination between sub-regional authorities and their local counterparts. The number of regions stayed the same. So basically, we observed the situation just prior to recent local elections when Ukraine held its local, sub-regional and regional elections in new territorial units. Of course, we should keep in mind that some territories in Ukraine are still suffering from occupation, and therefore elections were held in 23 regions, including the city of Kyiv, in 119 sub-regions, and in 1,420 amalgamated territorial communities. And the third reason why there was a lot at stake at current and recent elections was that actually the agenda of decentralization reform includes gaining more power to recently elected regional and sub-regional councils with the help of the constitutional reform that is due already next year. At least consultations are nearly successful. There are some remaining issues, mainly with respect to government's supervision over the decisions of self-government. So what are these powers in practice? They refer to introducing executive committees to regional and sub-regional councils on the one hand, and introducing the positions of prefects instead of regional, sub-regional state administrations. But my additional point here that even if the constitutional reform does not succeed next year or the following year, even now within the current legal framework, the elected regional and sub-regional councils are able to express no confidence to the respective heads of regional and sub-regional state administrations that are appointed by the president. So basically their political power is essential. So why did voters and parties act like there was not so much at stake at the 2020 regional elections? So let's just first look at the demand side, voters. Well, regretfully, they did not know much about the responsibilities of sub-state councils they elected. Why? Because apart from the more or less clear-cut responsibilities of local councils, the functions or the duties of sub-regional and regional councils were not actually decided by the parliament by the time of elections. So the parliament has only getting ready to introduce the amendments to the laws on regional executives and on self-governance. Therefore, basically basically voters faced an interesting decision when they heard a lot about decentralization and its implications, but they didn't know many concrete things about the functions and the responsibilities of sub-regional and regional councils they elected. As for the demand side parties, actually most of them were not ready to keep up with the new electoral rules suggested by the 2019 electoral code. So the rules were, on the one hand, very promising, because the point was to introduce open list proportional representation, which looked like a huge victory to a large share of specialists. But in practice, the 5% threshold was still in place, so political parties had to not only establish very quickly establish their local branches across the country, but also to ensure that they could find solid candidates to fill up the lists, so that this transparent list could be shown to voters in the bulletin. And basically, as a result, most parties, and I think that the only exception might have been Yulia Tymoshenko's fatherland party, they failed to complete this task successfully, and therefore they ended up mobilizing just territorially bounded electorates. At least it is evident from exit polls when we see how different are the electoral shares for parties in the east, the southeast on the one hand, and the west of the country on the other hand. So let me highlight the implications of this situation. Basically, Ukraine is simultaneously changing its policies. I'm talking about decentralization policy and institutions, right? The regional, sub-regional and local councils have been elected on the one hand. Ukraine is about to change the number of executives and the functions of both executives and self-governance. So these changes happen simultaneously. And there are short and medium-term implications for it. Actually, voters elected sub-regional councils in new sub-regions, whereas centrally appointed sub-regional executives are still functioning in old sub-regions. And in order to change this situation, the parliament has to amend legislation quickly, right? It is regretful that there was not enough political will to make these amendments in advance of the elections, but at least afterwards, there is an urgent need to make sub-regional authorities function effectively. As for the functions, the division of functions between regional, sub-regional and local authorities, again, it is essential to quicker register the respective law drafts. On the 30th of October, right, 1 week after, nearly 1 week after the elections, the law draft on the functions of sub-regional and regional executives was registered in the parliament. Also, there are medium-term implications. Prior to the elections, there were tensions already between the center and city mayors on the one hand, and city mayors and regional executives on the one hand. There are no reasons to expect that such tensions would not repeat further on. Also, there is an open question: would the party in office that does not win majorities in sub-regional and regional councils, would it choose to strengthen those councils where its political opponents basically have got good positions? So let me finish this presentation by highlighting the key point that introducing simultaneous changes of policies and institutions is a challenge. And actually, the policymakers in the center and now the newly elected policymakers at sub-state scales actually need to cooperate effectively in order not to allow decreasing the quality of public service provision, and for the sake of minimizing the risks of undermining state capacity from the bottom up. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Valentina, for a very interesting overview of what is going on with decentralization and what these elections suggest. So we'll now move on to our third speaker, Alena Podolyan, who is going to talk about the situation in West Ukraine and how it relates to the rest of Ukraine. I will see if you can take the floor now, Alena.
Thank you. I'll just share my screen.
Perfect. Perfect. And then if you can just get it onto full. Yes, there we go.
Yes, yeah, it's fine now. So my task today is to present local election results briefly and to connect it up to the image of the president and let's say his more or less the level of his popularity and his current approval in the region. So my presentation largely consists of those two parts, trying to address those two points. Before I go into more or less breakdown of local election results, I wanted to just very briefly outline the very general tendencies of political dynamics, which already were touched upon by previous speakers, of course. And I would like to open with observation made by Gwendolyn Sasse in her article of May this year, dedicated to the year evaluation of the year, first year presidency of Zelensky in the office. So in her view, there is a difference between popularity of a president and basically voting intentions of respondents. And what she observed back then is that respondents from Western Ukraine generally are significantly less likely to actually support him in terms of voting than respondents from three other macro regions. And these elections that we are discussing today, they indeed have shown the tendency of strengthening the role of local elites versus center. And as Valentina already nicely presented, that has to do a lot with context of this decentralization, with more powers invested in the regions, even if not widely known, as she pointed. And for example, in this region, we can see that the mayor of the largest and most important city, kind of regional center, Lviv, is emerging also as a winner and not representing the Zelensky party, and that is similar to situation in a few other large cities such as Kyiv, Kharkiv, Odessa, for example. Basically, to make it short, as I said, President's party seemed to have effectively lost local elections, both in terms of mayors, which I'll go into a bit more detail now, but also in terms of local representations in local councils, both district and Oblast. I'll focus on Oblast level today. And what's interesting also about this region as such, compared to three others, and I'll be followed by a presentation on the South, so I hope to get more context there as well. But European Solidarity, which is a party led by the former president, Petro Poroshenko, who also was the main rival of Zelensky, it seems to do particularly well, specifically in the West, and enters all city and oblast councils in contrast to his party. So I'll be pointing that out in a bit more detail now. First of all, I wanted to say that I follow Kyiv International Institute of Sociology classification. So they break Ukraine in 4 macro regions, west, east, south, and center, which I follow. And this and next 3 slides are presenting this result. I try to do it in a succinct way. I located, so there are 7 cities altogether, with Lviv, as I mentioned, being the regional center. And I broke them into cities per slide, and then I'll conclude with Lviv, this part of the presentation. So first of all, what I wanted to say is that I won't be taking you through all of them. There are a lot of small parties not known nationally, and I believe especially not abroad, but I think this, I hope at least this breakout helps to see a bit of dynamics, and again, not to tire you with many titles of these parties. I highlighted by bold actually parties that I mentioned before. So the president's so-called party, Servant of the People, with an abbreviation SN, and European Solidarity, ES, as you can see on the left. So you can see basically how these 2 parties in particular did in the elections, because I believe that's the main variation of one of the main variations of interest in the region. And also I will very briefly comment on mayors and basically city and oblast levels. In violent font, you have those parties which are specifically local parties. It was one of the peculiarities of this election that my colleagues already started mentioning, that quite a lot of local parties, either centered around mayors or just in the oblast, so region level, have been active and entered many of these councils. So in Ivano-Frankivsk, one of the regional centers, mayor remains is already known. He won in the first round. He represents Svoboda, national but mostly region-based party in Ukraine, rightist party. And as we can see here, Servant of the People hasn't even entered the city council, only the Oblast council on the 5th place. In Lutsk, another regional Oblast center, the mayor is in the lead, so he's to be decided in the 2nd round of elections. However, Igor Polishuk was in the lead now. He represents, again, not presidential party. The Maybutnya for the Future is the party backed up by one of the oligarchs, Igor Kolomoisky. And again, we can see here that Servant of People entered both councils, but on the 4th place. Now coming to the next 2 cities, 2 oblast centers in the region. I would say similar dynamics persist here as well. So in Rivne, we can see that person who is Viktor Sharkisyan, who is representing a local Rivne Together party, he's in the lead. Again, it's to be decided in the 2nd round of the elections, but apparently a Servant of the People won't be leading here. And when it comes to the city council and oblast council, it's represented in both, but on the 3rd and 2nd place accordingly. So in oblast council, at the oblast level, it has done slightly better. In Ternopil, mayor is also already known. He won in the 1st round, as in Ivano-Frankivsk, also with a high result. They're over 80–70% support by Svoboda as well. And Servant of the People here, abbreviation SN, as I mentioned, has entered only Oblast Council and on the 4th place. So again, quite low outcomes. When it comes to 2 last cities I'll present today, Uzhhorod and Chernivtsi. Uzhhorod being the oblast center of Zakarpattia, Transcarpathia region. Here there are slight peculiarities. So to begin with, Uzhhorod incumbent mayor is in the lead. He's followed by the candidate from the Servant of the People, but again, unless something changes significantly, this second candidate is unlikely to win in the second round. So again, probably mayor position won't be taken here by the president party. And in the city council, it has 5th place, and I'm sorry, 2nd place. And the same is the case in the Oblast Council. Finally, in Chernivtsi, a mayor is the person who is in the run-up for the position of the mayor is representing a local party, the single alternative, and he's facing or followed up rather by by the person who is a leader of another region-based party. So again, this is a case where a servant of the people won't be getting the position of the mayor. And when it comes to actual councils, we can see that it's 5th place in the city council that president's party is getting, and here it has done the best actually on the oblast level with the 1st place. So this is the Chernivtsi is the only region in the whole of the West macro region which has seen victory for the president's party at the oblast level, but only not in the city. And another peculiarity of this, as I mentioned, of these 2 cities is that, as you can see on the left as well, oppositional, so-called oppositional platform is represented in both councils in Uzhhorod and in at the oblast level also in Chernivtsi. This party is known for pro-Russian and connections with the old regime and pro-Russian views. So it's actually atypical for the Western macro-region as such to be represented. Finally, I come to representation in Lviv itself. As I mentioned, the biggest center. And usually political moves here are important as they are in Kiev for the rest of the country. Lviv was also specific from the very beginning of presidency of Volodymyr Zelensky because it was the only region which didn't actually where he didn't win. So division was very specific this time, in contrast to previous elections where the country was usually more or less split. In Lviv, in city council, again, incumbent mayor who is representing national but largely region-based party Self-Help, Samopomich, is leading against the representative of the European Solidarity. So again, whoever wins it won't be the president's position of the mayor. And in fact, Servant of the People hasn't even entered city council at all with 4.6%. So they have done particularly badly here, as well as I mentioned in the context of also previous lack of popularity. However, it has entered the Oblast Council with again a mix of national and region-based parties. So overall, based on these 4 slides and 7 cities, I hope it wasn't too many numbers, but as I thought, I didn't mean to focus on very specific numbers, but rather to show positions of main party and main rival in generally speaking in the ratings that we have at the moment. We can see that actually European Solidarity, so the rival party, is the only one which is which enters all district and city councils, and almost all councils will have also representatives of local parties, the ones that you saw highlighted in violet. I tried to select a neutral color there. And a Servant of the People hasn't entered 3 councils out of 7. So Ivano-Frankivsk, Ternopil, and Lviv, as you can see now, it won't be represented at all, and overall we can say that it has done better on oblast than actually oblast centers, large cities level. Now to sum it up a bit more, and also to connect it up to the second part of my presentation, and I'll finish briefly after this. how does it, what does it tell us about president's popularity and levels of approval in the region? There is a way of seeing this as these levels of voting support for parties as a proxy for president's popularity, but there is an observation in the literature that generally his personal popularity is higher than that of the party because of some personal traits attributed to him and personal popularity, but also because people disconnect what they see as party or authorities' mistakes from his own responsibilities. That's why it's partly a proxy, but it's not a very precise proxy. And to look a bit deeper into that, I try to find actually recent changes in his approval. And the closest in time and the most encompassing I could have found for the whole macro region was again Kyiv International Institute of Sociology surveys. So I looked at the difference in results between two of them. One was in April this year, one was in September, so nearly half a year difference between them. And as you can see in the second point, his ratings fell by average, on average by 10%. Whereas Poroshenko's, his rival, former rival anyway, but also currently in terms of party competition increased by a few percent. If we compare this trend to the general Ukrainian trend, his rating in the same time period fell from also by about 10%, so from roughly 42.6 to 31.8, followed by small increase by ratings of Poroshenko and Boykos. Maybe those who follow Ukrainian politics, they know roughly this rating of people who are seen as main candidates for potential presidency. And when it comes to party itself, its rating fell from 32 roughly to 21, so with about 11% decrease. Again, in contrast to increase of popularity of European solidarity in this region, and followed by, I just provide next 3 points of national parties in this region. So this leads me to, just before I conclude generally, to just try and observe, try and comment rather on what are we observing here. Is it a sea change in Western Oblast, in Western macro region? And I would say that it's probably, from what I could have seen, at least based on this brief material, it is probably early to give a decisive commentary on that, but it does seem that overall electoral support is decreasing, which does reflect the general trend throughout Ukraine. And in particular, if we look at two other regions, which will be done just after me, center is the region which seems to be following most closely in terms of party and also personal preferences for president. There are differences in East and West, but overall, Zelenskys' popularity is also decreasing there. And in terms of Lviv being less supportive, again, there is clear continuation between situation a year and a half ago during presidential elections and now. And just to illustrate this a bit, this also difference between studying approval of presidents personally, but also versus rather intention to vote for him in the next potential elections. So-called president survey was carried out during these local elections with 5 questions to people, and there was a question to respondents whether they were more positive about this, or whether they saw this as a sincere intention on part of the president to hear the popular opinion, or whether this was a manipulation, so more negative estimation of this survey and so-called survey. As you can see on the slide, top is West, second is Center, then is South, and the lowest line represents the East. I'm sorry for no translation here, but as you can see, the top line, the West has the longest blue bar. So again, in terms of understanding and approval, regions scores well, but in reality, actually, only 38% actually took part in this survey, much less than declared, and we seem to observe constantly the gap between personal approval or declarations and actual voting intentions or actual votes. So in local elections, actually, West was less represented and less positive than other regions. Contrary to this pre-election.
We have to wrap it up now and get on to our next speaker. Volodymyr, if you're able to take the floor now, just so that we can get on to the discussion afterwards. And we take the focus now to East Ukraine. Volodymyr, if you can take over.
Right, I'm here. So, can you hear me? Yes. Good. Hello everyone, good afternoon. I guess most of us, of our listeners are listening us from Europe somewhere, so it's probably good afternoon to all of you. And then I'm not sure if someone is watching from overseas in the US, who knows? It's a big day in the US too. We are on a roller coaster of elections now. We had a Ukrainian election, and as you mentioned, Matthew, we had Georgia and Moldova elections, and now, of course, today is a US election as well. And thank you for inviting me to take part in this event. I have a privilege of speaking last. So that means that a lot of good things and smart and wise things have been already said by my colleagues before me. So let me focus then on the issues that I would like to mention in my presentation. You won't be surprised if I would just repeat some of the things that have been said already, just to reinforce them, just because there is an agreement on several of those issues between myself and some of my colleagues. Well, first, what catches your eye if you look at the Ukrainian elections numerically is attendance. And actually, I promise to be light, unlike previous presentations on numbers and diagrams. But here some numbers are in order because attendance is really low. It's around 37% in the country altogether. In the south, here in the south, it's even lower. In the east, Donetsk is very low, around 30%. And next to that comes actually a bunch of oblasts, regions here in south of Ukraine or southwest of Ukraine even. Because in Mykolaiv is 32%, in Odessa, in Kherson is 32 plus, in Odessa it's around 35%. So it's quite low. In the city of Odessa, even lower, around 30%. In case of Odessa, actually, it's not very unusual. We are known specifically as a city, but also as a region, but more the city, as lazy voters, and a lot of people often abstain and don't come and don't vote. But it seems like in this case, there are many people who were lazy enough or active enough to abstain in many other regions in the country because it's really low percentage. And there were various attempts to explain, like why these people are not voting. And actually, there's been a number of sociological polls focused on this, and people have been asked of those who don't vote, was not planning to vote, like why, and all sorts of answers. One of them is coronavirus, but frankly, unfortunately, a lot of Ukrainians are not very serious about coronavirus and taking precautions and everything. So I don't believe that the major factor is that people were afraid of COVID, and that's why they didn't come to the voting precinct. So it must be something else. What else? It's a disillusionment. It's definitely lack of enthusiasm, or should I say a wave of unenthusiasm or non-enthusiasm. That's what we have. We often hear, I'm primarily an IR person, and I often talk about Ukraine in relation to other countries and so on. And we often talk about Ukraine fatigue in the West when Ukraine doesn't do what it's supposed to do, what it's expected to do. But in this case, it's Ukraine fatigue within Ukraine. A lot of people here are just plain tired and exhausted and sick of having all of this politicking and not and their standing of life is not improving and so on. So that's the major reason, I think, for the low attendance, of course, in addition to many other factors, but primarily the disillusionment. On particular political parties' results around the country and here in the south, it's interesting because none of the major political parties done well. And what I carry out in a summary of this vote as some sort of implication is that the political party system, the party system in Ukraine is still not quite formed. And we've been complaining about this for years, if not decades, that we don't have structured system, we don't have sustainable parties that would be there for years, as permanent parties with a particular set of values and principles and leaders who would be there for years, but they're just not there, and we can remember the presidential elections of last year when before the meteoric rise of Zelensky, people actually expected two major political figures, Poroshenko and Tymoshenko, to square off and decide who's going to be the next president of Ukraine. And then Zelensky factor happens, which appended all of that. And all of a sudden, no one really got big votes, but Zelensky himself. Similar things happened, of course, with the parliamentary elections a year ago. But since then, Zelensky is not there anymore as a magnet, as a hero, as a someone superhero, I would say, as some people saw him apparently when they voted for him and his party last year as well. People have mentioned before me already that they went really low. I mean, the question on Zelensky was always like, how long would it take for Ukrainians to get disillusioned and disappointed with his program and his inability, I'm afraid, and definitely lack of preparedness for the principled implementation of reforms program and the reform agenda. And expectations were extremely high and realistically high. And that's why it's not surprising that Ukrainians are now, turning cool on Zelensky. That's a problem, and that's what we have, and it's been quite fast, frankly. What we have now, we have a president who still have at least 3.5 years ahead of him, and who is already in many ways a lame duck, who is already not having enough of support from the populace, surprisingly, because he had so much of it just a year and a half ago. So that's a problem, I guess, for him. I mean, for the weak politically, domestically head of executive branch. That's a problem for many of us as well. I mean, as someone, again, who does a lot of analysis related to foreign policy, international security, I worry about him being weakened domestically, politically, being a factor in affecting Ukraine's standing and position internationally, specifically vis-a-vis Russia, where the war is still ongoing and the conflict in Donbass is still not resolved and aggression of Russia is still ongoing. So that's some of the ramifications that you have here. And that's a problem. So the servant of the people didn't do well. Even in Odessa, Odessa was extremely enthusiastic in the spring of last year about Zelensky candidature, and then later on his party. But now it's between 13 and 15%. So it's not much different from any other region, basically, except for his own hometown area of Kryvyi Rih. I mean, basically all other regions turned really down, really sour on Zelensky. So that's what really you mentioned the moment you look at the results. But other parties, look at the other parties. The Batkivshina, for instance, the veteran of Ukrainian politics, it's hardly there. I mean, and once again, don't get me wrong. I mean, Yulia Tymoshenko proved again and again that she is a survivor. That she is not going down, that she is a mainstay of Ukrainian politics. But her party didn't do well at all. Not in any part of Ukraine, really, except for few districts and regions here and there. But around the country, not well. Here in Odessa city, definitely not well. In some districts of the region of Odessa, a little better, but still negligible results. So that's a problem. And then we don't have this strong political parties that we've hoped they'll be formed, and where you would have the civilized, more or less civilized, quotation marks, debates before elections and so on, where you can understand what they stand for, and that's why you tend to vote for them or not, vote for them and stuff like that. But it's still chaotic. It's still messy. It's still not structured well enough. And Европейская солидарность, actually European solidarity, Poroshenko party done really well, and people talked about it, including in Odessa, here in Odessa. What does that mean? Well, I mean, they didn't get the 25% that Poroshenko got in the last presidential elections last spring, of course, but no one expected them to do that. In fact, many people, including and according to sociological polls, many people expected them to do much worse than they did. And here in Odessa, for instance, it's much better results. It's good results in the city, decent results in the oblast, and not even for the mayor's run. Petro Obukhov, for whom I voted, many of my friends voted here in Odessa, a young entrepreneur, a bright figure, and we are optimistic because actually the top of the list here for European solidarity looks very promising in terms of personnel. So we shall see. I mean, I'm still far from saying that I expect Poroshenko's political force to be reinstated to the extent as it was a major force in Ukrainian politics a few years ago. I don't think that would happen, but they are the political party, the force that needs to be taken into consideration. On decentralization, interesting things been said already. A good reform, a great thing to do. But from the very beginning, a lot of people warned about some positive, negative results and consequences of decentralization. For instance, I mean, giving power to the regions and the local self-government is great, but in fact, a lot of times communities didn't get any, piece of that power. So in many cases, it's still functionaries, but on a lower level, who are deciding how to use money without any consultations with the community, with Hromada, as we say here today, with people who live in the region, with the residents. So that's unfortunate. Another thing, of course, a lot of money for the local elites. I think that's been mentioned already. They're flushing with money, at least they were for a while, and that could be a problem. I mean, if they spend money wisely, that's good for the region, and for the infrastructure and everything, and roads and healthcare and stuff. But if they don't, if they pocket much of that money, as we, suspect them to do, according to the old tradition, unfortunate tradition here in Ukraine, that's another thing. And they are reinforced with this big money. They can use some of that money for their political purposes and their campaigns and political ends. And that's a problem. I mean, that's really a problem where decentralization can be a step towards federalization, of which we were all so against for years, because we didn't want to have Ukraine weakened as a unitary, unified state. In fact, the local strongmen did really well in these elections, definitely everywhere in the south and the east, but also many other parts of the country. But which means that in this case, in the south and the east, that's party of regions people. I mean, of course, when Yanukovych fled, the party of regions kind of collapsed, their faction in the parliament and so on. But the people never left, really, Ukrainian politics. They've stayed through difficult times, but they were never persecuted. They kept their connections. They kept their resources. They kept a lot of support of local voters, and that's why they are a little kind of coming back. In fact, they probably didn't come back as forcefully as I expected them this time around, and that's good. Like in Odessa, for instance, even the opposition platform for life didn't do too well. Neither on a city level nor on oblast regional level. In mayor's races, to which I would come a little later, they still have their man, Mr. Skorik, so he has a chance to become our next mayor. But they were not, they were not very strong either. So, I mean, decentralization is working, but that's an ambivalent process. I mean, it's a process which brings a lot of good, but which brings a lot of risks. And that should be taken into account here. Also here, everywhere in Ukraine, definitely in Odessa, we didn't talk much about oligarchs, but they're still around, they are lurking around the corner. They were very active in Ukraine. They never stopped being active, obviously. I mean, often the focus is, the accent is on Kolomoisky, one of those oligarchs, big business / financial figures in Ukraine. Others are around as well. Kolomoisky probably is more active, maybe more arrogant, maybe more outspoken in terms of being, talking to the journalists often not being shy and everything like that. But others are around, and many parties are in their pockets, and many parties are their personal petty political projects. So that's a problem for Ukraine. The oligarchization of Ukrainian politics is still here with us, and this last round of elections have proven that once again. One other thing is that we have some popular, 2 minutes left, thank you, some populist parties, obviously. Always they're rotating. Like a few years ago, we were mostly talking about Lashko and his radical party. They're not around really anymore. There are different other types of populist politics, and also people debated, is Zelensky, was Zelensky phenomenon a populist phenomenon or not? You know, but that's open to debate still, is, even if we talk about it in a retrospective. There is a new popular populist party led by Shari, and unfortunately they're making it to the city council here in Odessa. That's a populist party, but with a clear pro-Russian sentiment in it. So that's interesting. He's primarily anti-establishment guy, but he has this flavor, which is very much pro-Russian. You know, so that's the problem. And finally, here in Odessa, they're trying to come back to the language issue, which has been a big deal in Ukrainian politics for years. But ever since 2014, not so much, actually. And they're trying to come back to it. And they're trying to, you know, peddle this issue of Russian language, and you should vote for us because you're Russian speakers, and Russian language rights, Russian speakers' rights are disenfranchised, are endangered, and stuff like that. There was already a slogan on many boards around Odessa with Odessa and one S in it being crossed over, you know, because in Russian it's 2S, in Ukrainian it's 1S, and so they told us they would give us our old name of the city back. So language issue, unfortunately, which is a divisive issue here in Ukraine, definitely here in the south and east, is again politicized and again alive and kicking, not to the extent like it was prior to 2014, but it is. The mayor's race is going to happen in the second round. 2 guys who are running, both former Party of Regions guys, you know, and that's unexpected, not unexpected, unavoidable, you know, unavoidable here in Odessa. You know, one is Mr. Trukhanov. I was a little surprised that he didn't win in the first round. He got around 35%, so there will be a runoff the second round. And another Mr. Skorik, and both from opposition platform for life, and both of them are former Party of Regions people. So that's interesting. And most finally, there are also memory wars here in Ukraine. I mentioned Odessa city name. Trukhanov close to elections. He already announced his initiative to return some of the older street names to, you know, the previous names to those streets, including Marshal Zhukov, for instance, instead of Avenue of Heavenly 100, Heroes of Heavenly 100, which is a big deal, you know, which is definitely against the laws on decommunization. So will he proceed, act up on this when he is elected? A lot of people think that he probably wouldn't, but at least that he has used the slogan, he went to this field and domain of memory wars, is interesting and troubling, because that's dividing Odessa. After all, we're talking about the city, which on May 2nd in 2014, where you had people clashing and people dying in the streets of Odessa. So I would like to stop here. I mean, there are some, you know, results in these elections that gives us some hope, and there are others that make us, you know, feel a little down. On a balance, the struggle continues. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Volodymyr. Okay, thank you very much to all 4 presenters for giving us some different perspectives and some interesting frameworks, and also a number of questions that have come to my mind to get the conversation going. I encourage all of you as speakers to think about any questions you have for each other at this stage. But just to get things moving forward with the Q&A and the discussion, I have some questions for each presenter. So first of all, for Yuri, I wonder, I'll first of all give the questions to everyone and then you can all respond. So first of all, for Yuri, you've talked about this idea that in Ukraine, there's something of a stable hybrid regime there. So I've got 2 questions for you. First of all, what is your view on what happened with Yanukovych with the Maidan revolution? Was this not a case where the hybrid regime was shifting towards autocratic kind of condition? And we are seeing right now is a big jolt, a reaction against this, the post-Maidan politics of Ukraine. So where do you, so that's sort of a question there. where do you put Zelensky in this picture? Is he trying to reform this hybrid system? Is he trying to move it somewhere else? What's your interpretation of his reforming program? And maybe you could give some points, some comments on this. Questions for Valentina. Can I ask you, what's your view on where this decentralization program comes from? What's the inspiration for it? And does it come from the EU to some extent? Is it an engagement between Kiev and the EU, or is there another source from it? And what is the ultimate agenda with decentralization as far as you see it? Is it to make democracy more effective, or is there some other aspect that's more practical that we should see in the ultimate goal of this decentralization program? For Elena, I would ask you, I would apologize for interrupting you when you were talking, and I would ask you to move towards the conclusions of what is shifting in Western Ukraine in terms of the political landscape. So if I could give you a chance to go back to your conclusions on this, because I would like maybe also for you to give me an answer to how you would characterize the Poroshenko's, well, I put it in inverted commas, patriotic nationalist kind of bloc that he has there. Now, of course, that is not perhaps helpful to call it nationalist or patriotic, but what is their platform? Where are they moving? Would you say that their popularity is on the rise again? Should we understand the European Solidarity Party as having its base in West Ukraine, or is that an erroneous view? Would you say that they're capable of winning votes across the whole country again? Okay, and finally, questions for of course, for Volodymyr. The questions I have it relates to how you would characterize the platforms of these so-called pro-Russian parties. Now, are you seeing some shift away from what they were arguing under the parties of region? Do you see some continuity in their arguments, their platforms, the policies they are promising to deliver? If you can unpack this platform, and perhaps also give your view on what you think, what is this question of Russian involvement in Southeast Ukraine politics? How, do you see much evidence of it right now, or are they more focused on what they're doing in the Donbass, which is, you know, slightly outside of active politics of Ukraine because it's somewhat suspended? So there, I've just offered some questions, and for each speaker to go, perhaps if Yuri can begin. Yeah.
All right, thanks for the questions, and I will start from your first questions about the attempts of Yanukovych to establish some sort of authoritarian rule, and that was the second attempt in the recent Ukrainian history. The first one was under Kuchma, and both failed. And they failed to a large extent because not of the democratic impulses of the society, but this is also the reason, right? But mostly because they were too weak to establish autocracy. And that there is no shortage of explanation in the political science literature why it is happening in the weak states. So when the central authority is too weak to establish its power, it's become a lame duck, like Volodymyr just described Zelensky, and that president is already failed. So Yanukovych made several strategic mistakes when Maidan began, and that mistakes were also under the pressure from Russia, but they ended that Yanukovych and his party had just evaporated from Ukraine. So the second attempt was unsuccessful, and that also shows why those hybridity that I explained later is still in place. So this is not because of the will of the people and the strength that people put on it. I do not diminish the very fact that Maidan was a revolutionary event, but still the major factor is within the system itself, within the structure of government and the architecture of authoritarian institutions. They were too weak to survive. And now, when we turn to Zelensky and his reform and the prospects where he is going, it's very hard to say, because for me, from my perspective, he is a stage populist, and he is very emotional personality, and he is not fit for this role, for the role of the president in Ukraine. He is in a state of constant distress, and he is, his actions and his words, and the last one that I described before, is very emotional. So I cannot, there is only one reform that was passed during the Zelensky president, I mean land marketization. But that was not because of his will or his program, that was because our Western partners requested that the land is becoming a market value, and that was a condition for this next part of lending to Ukraine. So that was under the pressure coming from behind. So from my perspective, what Zelensky is doing, this is very unconsequential, inherent, not consequent. So this is the type of a person that was a stranger in Ukrainian politics. And this is bad for Ukraine that we have that president. This is, of course, my opinion.
The sound.
Okay. Matthew, I cannot hear you. Just turn on your...
Sorry, I muted myself. If there's any participants that would like to respond to Yuri now, that would be also appropriate to the comments that Yuri made. Vladimir, yeah. And you also must unmute. Yeah.
Right, very briefly indeed. Just two comments on two things that Yuri has said. I know I've been critical about Zelensky today, and actually for those who know me all along, I said that Zelensky is already a lame duck president, but I wouldn't be as categorical in terms of definite in terms of him a failure, in general, because he might still reset himself, I think, or relaunch himself. I don't think he'll be able to do that for a number of reasons, including those that Yuri just articulated. Him personally not being suitable for this position and so on, and not competent and things like that, and naive, and the list goes on. But time is ahead, if someone comes around in his inner circle who is more reforms oriented, for instance, that might change, or if the new government is more successful. I mean, I'm really trying to see how that can actually turn out in a better way with Zelensky. I'm not optimistic at all, but I wouldn't say that he is like lost and he's failed dramatically already, and there's no way back for him. And second short comment is on the West's role, because as Yuri has said on this marketization of land or land reform, West has requested to do that. The role of West is huge, and I should mention that to all of our listeners, listening to us from outside of Ukraine. It's always been and still is. And unfortunately, we want to have the West being involved and engaged with Ukraine. And by West, I mean all countries in Europe, US, and others. And unfortunately, we often see that those countries are fatigued with Ukraine, disengaged, they have their own priorities. Now there is a COVID epidemics everywhere, US with their COVID and elections and so on, distance from Ukraine and so on. But to us, it's very important, because Ukrainian political class, unfortunately, still often does good things only when pushed gently in their backs to do the right thing, because they're actually aware of what it would mean to do the right thing, but they need this gentle push. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
And I would also, a small response to Yuri. I heard the word populist to describe Zelensky, and I can agree with some of the other adjectives like incompetent or emotionally kind of unstable. But populist, I wonder, is populism an alternative to this? Could be he is a centrist in some ways. Is he a political centrist? Now, it's a question, because if you look at some of the other candidates that are there that are more clearly right-wing or more clearly taking perhaps more radical positions, does Zelensky in some way take the political center ground in Ukraine? Or is it more productive to understand him in terms of a populist reaction to the old political class, the old political establishment. I just wonder if this question of centrism is of any value.
Well, we are using somewhat different terminology in Ukraine, and when we are discussing and describing Zelensky, we often could hear that he is a type of personality that he is trying to reveal some sort of Russianist or post-Soviet frames and discourses and mentality, whatever. So I guess your description of Zelensky as a centrist is very close to this definition. So he has no agenda, political agenda, from my perspective, but he is trying to be likened by many people in the West and in the South and in the center, because he was perceived as a new person, as a newcomer. And that newcomer was very popular when he was on stage. But when he gets to the real challenges that the presidential jobs has, so that was a very painful for him, I guess. So, and this is a he is in constant search for supporters, for some sort of guidance, and that's why he's so dependent on his people around him, initially on Bogdan, now on Yermak, etc. And the people who were with him when he was at his show. So I don't think that any good person that would appear in a government or in a very close circles with Zelensky would make a difference. So there were many reformers at the very beginning, and there were very good people at the very beginning, but they now out of politics, and that's unfortunate. So I don't think also that Zelensky is a loser. I didn't say that, and he's not failed at the moment. He is trying at his best, and I wish him success, because at stake there is just the fate of Ukraine.
Excellent. Thank you. So now we'll move on to Valentina, and just to sort of also say that the hybrid system before 2014 and post 2014, there's some attempts to reform it, and one of the attempts to reform it is decentralization. So Valentina, I'll let you maybe respond to the question I gave earlier.
Yeah, thank you very much, Matthew, and thank you for the participants who asked these questions. Let me just start from a very brief remark that actually when President Zelensky started doing his job, there were lots and lots of rumors that the decentralization reform would suffer the most. And some were even afraid that there were that the proceedings would be absent. But in fact, what we face is the example of fostering decentralization in line with those suggestions and those law drafts that were prepared by his predecessors. And now I'm coming back to the first question that I was asked about, the roots of decentralization. So in fact, the current reform started with the concept presented on the 1st of April 2014. So it was prior to President Poroshenko's start of his job. It was when the country was in a very difficult position. So in fact, domestic policymakers managed to cooperate very effectively with domestic experts who by that time have been working on developing law drafts. And the external help in a form of international technical assistance, of course, played a huge role. But here I am pointing out various stakeholders. So basically, of course, we have got the biggest project, ULEAD, generously, very generously funded by the EU and other states. But we should also keep in mind that there is the Council of Europe that Ukraine is a member of, that pays a lot of attention to law drafts on decentralization, and also other countries like, for example, Japan, who make their contribution. Therefore, of course, we can talk about help with expertise, financial help, but when we're talking about ownership, even chronologically, we refer to domestic policymakers and experts. And moreover, my claim is, according to my little research on that particular matter, those experts that are believed to be the core experts on the current post-2014 decentralization reform acknowledge in their interviews, in their articles, that actually they have been working on their law drafts before the Euro-Maidan uprising. Therefore, I think that it is really a joint ownership of domestic experts and policymakers. And when we're talking about policymakers, we should also remember that some previous attempts failed, like Besmertny's contribution was a failure. But currently, the circumstances allowed making it more successful due to the combination of internal and external participation. Regarding the second question about the agenda, right, the ultimate agenda. Well, I would just briefly refer to three things that literatures claim decentralization reform can help with. So first of all, it is local participation. Secondly, it is the improvement of public service provision. And third point is about making governance work better, cheaper and more effectively. In the case of Ukraine, from the very, very beginning, and it is clearly written in the 2014 concept, public service provision was named to be the core aim of decentralization reform. And actually, it is supported by the forthcoming changes, legal changes. But this was true till summer 2020. When the parliament decided to decrease the number of sub-regions, the government and the parliament acknowledged that this time they pursued another goal, not the improvement of public service provision, but improvement of how government operates. As for local participation, and here I refer to the question I received after my presentation from one of the participants, just answering it right now. Local participation in the case of Ukraine proved to foster amalgamation when it was voluntary, right, till February 2020. But it did not help increasing turnout at sub-state elections. This is supported by the data we have access to. But let me make it clear that data the Central Commission, Electoral Commission shares with us does not allow making very accurate comparisons, but what it makes it clear that indeed turnout does not improve, unfortunately, disregarding the experience of amalgamation. Even after the remaining communities were merged administratively, we do not see, at least we are not able to see now, any difference in turnout. Moreover, local participation during the process of amalgamation had its pros and contras. There were participants, residents, who supported amalgamation, and there were those who opposed it very actively. Especially, it is surprising to know that not only in the south of the country, but in some western communities. It is surprising that data demonstrates that communities in eastern Ukraine were less resistant to amalgamation, which is a surprising outcome. But I would like to finish the answer to this question on a slightly more optimistic note, to say that if we look at turnout, at the recent election, we actually see that the striking differences, regional differences, actually became less striking. So if we compare turnout at the 2020 elections with turnout at 2015 election, we see that the difference right now was about 12% between the lowest and the highest turnout in regions, whereas at previous elections it was around 20%. Therefore, my point is that disregarding this low turnout at 2020 elections, we actually see that it became less regionalized. And it is probably something that we can thankful to the experience of participation in amalgamation when it was voluntary till 2020. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Valentina. And you're leading us on to where we want to go next, which is the old idea that Ukrainian politics are divided between West and East, and I suppose post-Maidan expectation that that might change, and that brings us on to Alena to talk about what her conclusions were about West Ukraine and 2020. Alena, if you're able to back and move, yeah, connect you.
Thank you, Matthew, for an opportunity to come back to this, and I'm sorry for running out of time, but basically I was done. It's exactly the conclusion that was left, and I would just recap what I said, that the very kind of crude difference is that West and Center are characterized by success more of nationwide parties. Some of them were, well, as this is from presentation, some of them were really local, which were highlighted by Violet, but generally speaking, even parties like Svoboda or Samopomich, they still are nationwide parties, even if their main support base is in the West. In the East and South, and here Vladimir can fill up, local parties and blocs are more pronounced, and again, maybe that is one of those remaining polarization issues which might come to the surface a bit more, especially when all these councils start working, because possible polarization after these elections was one of the fears of experts that I come across preparing for today. We'll see, but in that sense, West is relatively national level oriented, as it has been for a while now, and it is followed by Center more or less. Center seems to be just falling behind if it continues, you know, if tendencies continues as they are. And the two still, especially Center is a bigger region, so hopefully overall it won't be too polarized, but there might be a bit of difference with South and East in that respect. I already mentioned that overall party hasn't done well, and to an extent that you can project president's popularity from that, or juxtapose from that. So basically Uzhhorod was, which has its own regional peculiarities due to also support of pro-Russian parties. Uzhhorod has been the most supportive, Lviv has been the least supportive, and that is again clear, I would say, continuation. But I'm not sure, when you also asked about this question about can we talk to some extent about coming back of either Poroshenko, his party at least. I'm not sure how much this success that I also try to highlight all the time, comparing to president's party. I'm not sure if success of European solidarity can be as much repeated in other macro regions. It has done relatively well, that's true, but as I understand, you know, there are limits to possible success, both due to this a lot of negative, I would say, associations with personality of Poroshenko, but which was very much an issue a year ago before the elections, but I mean before presidential elections. But also these regions, and again here I hope Vladimir can continue, these regions have their own preferences in terms of alternative parties. So it won't be so much European solidarity, even if servant of people goes down more, but it's again, it's a positional platform, unfortunately, and in the East, and maybe more local also parties like Trukhanov, for example, I don't know, this kind of mayor-centered parties in the South. So in that sense, I wouldn't be too optimistic that we can just juxtapose this development in the West for the rest, apart from maybe Center. And what I did find overall is that this opening from Gwendolyn Sasevich, which I started, the difference between voting election intentions and just personal preferences or approval is quite big, and it persists for Zelensky, I would say again, so that his approval is higher than potential voting for him. But problem which persists and which I don't have an answer to is, of course, competitors. That, for example, if, the questions I usually ask in all the surveys, if elections take place next Sunday, let's say presidential elections, whom would you support? It depends, because right now with leaders of other political forces like Poroshenko, Tymoshenko, Boyko, it seems that Zelensky is still in the lead. And that's why it makes it very difficult to project. And that's why I was quite cautious in my evaluation, because he is clearly losing popularity, as does his party, but does it necessarily mean change or rapid change? I'm not so sure. This is very just recap or my own reflections on this. And I received one question as well, just clarifying that if the Central Election Commission has yet to finalize the results, how can the final round be held next Sunday? I'm sorry if I said next Sunday, maybe I just mentioned, slip of the tongue during presentation. As far as I know, yes, by 6th of November, we must have final results, and it will be decided by the 15th. So most likely the second round will be held on 22nd of November, but I'm not sure if it applies to all cities at the same level. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alena. And I wanted to before we go to Volodymyr, Volodymyr mentioned this thing about fatigue, Ukraine fatigue. And I wonder, there's a question that anyone can respond to. Is there also a fatigue, perhaps in West Ukraine as well, with maybe the memory wars, with the struggle for language laws, or with the kind of struggle against Russia? Is there any fatigue creeping into this? And maybe is the Poroshenko or the Svoboda party, are they coming up with some new narratives, for example, vis-a-vis how they are being oppositional, how they are challenging Zelensky, for example? And that's kind of a question. Because I do notice some fatigue creeping in to Russian politics about the kind of Ukraine, fighting in Ukraine kind of narrative. Some fatigue is coming into this Russian political environment. I wonder as well in Ukraine, is there some fatigue with that? So I'd invite anyone to respond to that if they want to. Otherwise, I will allow Volodymyr to take his response. Yeah, I just have to unmute yourself, Volodymyr.
Right. Yeah, but you have to first allow me to unmute myself. Yeah. Okay. So that's working now. All right. So I would like to start right where Olena finished when she said about announcing the results. One of the things that I don't think wasn't mentioned. I mean, one of the things that got no mention, in other words, is that there were a lot of delays with announcing results. Clearly, here in Odessa region in the city, some results are not fully announced even now. So that's a problem, and there have been many rumors, and I think quite substantiated rumors, that this is a result of some falsification, of some power struggles and hand-wringing after the vote. And there have been some of the well-known, unfortunate samples of carousel voting, for instance, here in Odessa on voting day. And, old habits die really hard, and that's a problem here in Ukraine. And I don't know about other regions. I wasn't following closely here in Odessa. A lot of people are just appalled about how for days and days people never left there. I mean, the people working in the electoral commissions never left their precincts. They couldn't. They were just voting and counting and recounting and things like that. So, I mean, troubling things, not on a massive scale. Obviously, the general impression of this election is it was free and fair and we kind of matched the criteria. But the problem is that there have been some deviations here and there. Second thing on your question about the east and west of Ukraine and how they are together or not, there's been this struggle between two trends, one for consolidation and another one is, so it's consolidation versus coming apart. And in many ways, East and West got closer since 2014, indeed. And then this consolidation was, however, not something which is permanent, I'm afraid. You know, definitely much of that analysis, so to speak, quotation marks, that we've seen on Ukraine in years prior, that it's just black and white, it's just East and West, and they never could come together. You know, they're so different, like Mars and Venus. You know, and everything mentality, everything is different. It's, you know, Russian versus ethnic Ukrainian, or Russian speakers versus ethnic Ukrainian speakers. Much of that was very simplistic and naive and not scholarly and so on. But there are some differences, you know, and those differences went away a little bit since 2014, clearly in 15 and 16. But like I said, there are many factors working into that, eating into that consolidation, you know, roughening it out somehow. First, the war is ongoing and it's never stopping, you know, and you know, how long can we have this consolidation around the war, which is becoming permanent feature and costing lives, and it's not popular. I mean, no one wants to lose here in Ukraine, and polls show that Ukrainians don't want to let Crimea or Donbass go, obviously, but at the same time, there is definitely no appetite for continuation of wars and casualties and so on. And second thing, which is even more important, like, is there a success within Ukraine? Is there reforms, finally? Is there an improvement in the level, standing of living and level that people have with their lives? And these two main factors are eating into that consolidation. We're seeing less of it now, I'm afraid. And in many ways, the Ukrainian political field is kind of coming back to the pre-2014 ways, unfortunately, slowly. There is still plenty of that consolidation, but much less than we've seen 3 or 4 years ago. And most finally, on two questions that you posed to me, Matthew, first on the platform of Party of Regions, well, they are careful enough. I mean, they are opportunistic and situational. They don't go too far if not needed. I mean, they primarily focus on the social economic situation in the country. You know, they primarily focus on, you know, growing prices and low pensions and salaries. And they say, look, everything was fine before Euromaidan, and then this post-Euromaidan elites are screwing you up, people here in Ukraine. That's their message, basically. And that's, you know, they don't really need to go that far. So that's more or less typical opposition kind of discourse and narrative. Occasionally, in various regions, like here in the south and east, they would go into the language issue, into the history issue, like who is the real hero of Ukraine, historically speaking, and stuff like that. But occasionally, not too many times. And the same thing with the Russian involvement here. It's always here, but it's much more subtle than comparing to how it was, say, in 2014. You know, and even prior to 2014, it's much more subtle in a way because, again, do they give money to pro-Russian political parties? We don't know that. Probably not. They have their own money, plenty of it, actually. Like I said, they have resources. Do they support organizationally somehow? Yes. Information resource? Yes. Complicated business for them because on basic cable packages, TV packages, you still can't listen to or watch Russian TV in most parts here in Ukraine. But a lot of people have special packages and satellite dishes and stuff like that. So there is some information penetration here and information support coming from Russia here, obviously. And the messages are translated by certain politicians, and there is signaling. People like Boyko, a leader of opposition platform for Life, they would go to Moscow, for instance, and they would meet with like Putin and Medvedev and others. And that's a messaging to their electorate, which remains even now, yes, in the 7th year of war against Russia, pro-Russian electorate. So, I mean, in that respect, and you can add the role of your Russian Orthodox Church here in Ukraine, which is still huge, tremendous, big one. You know, in that respect, the Russian involvement is still here, but maybe much less visible and not that instrumental and active for us to see as it was, say, in 2014.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Vladimir. I don't know if any other speakers have received questions privately, but I do have someone in the audience who would like to ask a question. Caroline Hill, one of our researchers. Are you still there, Caroline? Will you connect up to ask a question?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah, hear you loud and clear.
Yeah. Okay, good afternoon, and thank you all for your presentations. I have a question for Olyana and the other speakers if they wish to join in. we had a discussion of right-wing politics in Poland last week, in which I floated the idea that right-wing politics is a matter of supply and demand, and voting patterns could be seen as a kind of reflection of this. And so when we look at the results for the Svoboda Party in Western Ukraine, I was wondering if you could comment on the lower percentages that they had in certain cities, specifically Uzhhorod and Chernivtsi. And do you think that this has something to do with minority language policies that would affect these regions? And what implications does it have for that issue? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. And yes, I would invite others to join if I only answer the aspect of it. As you said, Svoboda has done well only in a few cities, and specifically looking at Uzhhorod and Chernivtsi, I also grouped them on one slide. They're quite specific cities in the sense that they are quite multinational. Or, you know, the centers of more multinational regions that oblasts, sorry, than the rest of oblast of the region. And it probably has to do, just to connect it up briefly to Matthew's question, which we haven't really addressed, if Western Ukraine gets tired of, to put it very abruptly, of you know, identity politics. I think it doesn't, to put it shortly, simply because identity is consolidated in that region. It's not questioned and it's not really challenged as throughout the rest of the country, more or less. And so it's a natural, I would say, or maybe not natural. Natural is not a great word, but a stable, let's say, support base. And Uzhhorod and Chernivtsi, as Caroline has rightly observed, have been characterized since Soviet Union and pre-even Soviet Union, because Chernivtsi were the region was obviously Romanian dominated prior to the incorporation into the Soviet Ukraine, more multinational region. So my hunch here, I didn't study specifically this outcome, but you're right, there is a difference, and my hunch would be that simply more Ukrainian identity-based parties, you know, they do less well because of higher minorities, basically, and more multinational composition, I would say, of oblast. Svoboda has been on decline for a while anyway, but again, I didn't look specifically in Svoboda's support and reasons for that. That would be my very, very basic hunch about it. Thank you. Excellent.
Thank you very much. Well, we are basically coming to the end of today's webinar, and I'm wary of people's time and the other commitments they have. So unless there are any final comments or final questions, I will move things towards a close today, if that sounds okay to everyone. Some people have connected up very late. Valentina is very late in Japan at the moment. So what I really want to do is say thank you to all of the participants for coming today and for providing fascinating talks and giving us a lot to take away today and think about. And I will tell you that there will be, this will be also going up on YouTube later. We'll have access to this event online. So I also thank you, the audience, for being there and for sending in your questions. And so I will end the event now then, in that case. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much indeed. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.